In this video, we are going to use a method called completing the square to derive the quadratic formula. Completing the square is a useful method for solving quadratic equations that are not factorable. We're going to use that method, completing the square, in order to come up with a rule for any quadratic equation there is, and that we'll call the quadratic formula. So we start with this general quadratic equation. This could be any quadratic equation with any value for a and any value for b. So we're going to complete the square, and that means turning one side of this equation into a perfect square trinomial so that we can square root it and solve. So to do this, to get a perfect square trinomial, I need to get c onto the other side. So I'll start with ax squared plus bx equals negative c. Now when we did completing the square, we only did it if the leading coefficient was 1. Which means I need to get rid of that a term. So I'm going to divide everything by a. And we'd end up with x squared plus b over ax, that's the coefficient of x, equals negative c over a. You'll notice I'm leaving a big space right here. That's because that's where we're going to add a constant so that on the left-hand side we have a perfect square trinomial. So I want this left-hand side to be a perfect square trinomial. In order to make it a perfect square trinomial, I need to figure out what perfect square would go in the box. There's a formula to figure that out. You take this term, b over a, and divide it by 2. That would be the same as multiplying by 1/2. So b over a divided by 2 would be times 1/2, gives you b over 2a. So that's step 1. And step 2 is you square it. So we get b squared over 4a squared. So that's the number that's going to go in the box on the left and on the right hand side, because whatever we do to the left hand side of an equation, we must do to the right. So I'm going to write that in now. B squared over 4a squared, b squared over 4a squared. Now that I have a perfect square trinomial, I can factor it, because all perfect square trinomials are factorable by definition. So I'm going to factor that, and it would give us x plus b over 2a squared, and this b over 2a is the same one that was right here. So on the left-hand side, it's x plus b over 2a squared, and then on the right-hand side, I just need to add these two fractions. So I'm going to do that off to the side. So when I add these fractions, I would have to have the same denominator, which I'm going to make my denominator 4a squared. The second fraction already has a denominator of 4a squared, so I can keep that the same. And the first fraction I'm going to need to multiply by 4a over 4a. So I would end up with negative 4ac. So when you put those together, you would have that one denominator, which was 4a squared. And now my numerator, I'm going to write it in the form that we use. We always write b squared minus 4ac. So we've got a nice positive leading coefficient there. From here, we're going to take the square root of both sides in order to get x alone, because that's the whole purpose of what we're doing. We're trying to solve for x. So we'll take the square root of both sides. And that would end up giving us, on the left-hand side, we would just write x plus b over 2a. And on the right-hand side, when you take the square root of a fraction like this, you can separate the square root, the radical, do the square root of the top and the square root of the bottom. Make sure though we have the plus or minus, because we took the square root to solve this equation. So on top we'd have b squared minus 4ac, and on the bottom we've got the square root of 4a squared. That denominator though actually simplifies. The square root of 4a squared, you could take the square root of 4 and just get 2, and the square root of a squared is a. So now what we've got is x plus b over 2a equals plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And there's only one more thing to do to get x alone. Right now x has this term over here, and we need to get rid of that term. You get rid of that term by subtracting. So we'll subtract b over 2a from both sides. So we get x is negative b over 2a. Then the plus or minus was attached to this b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And to make this look really nice, I see that I have two fractions and they already have the same denominator, so I can put them together. And this is what I would end up with. Fraction bar. On the denominator, it's just the common denominator 2a. And in the numerator, I've got the negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac. And that's it. That's the quadratic formula. You could use that now to solve any quadratic equation there is. It may not always be the most convenient method, but it is a method.